On the 30th of July, 1970, shortly before 2 in the afternoon, in the harsh summer light over the Gulf of Suez, 4 Mirage 3C fighters climbed to 35,000 feet as if on a routine reconnaissance run. On the ground at Tel Nof Air Base, Squadron Commander Avihu Ben Nun glances once at his wristwatch, then back at the operations map. The plan on the table is simple on paper. A bait formation, electronic jamming, phantoms hidden low over Sinai, and a narrow envelope of time before fuel runs out. Later that night, a wire service will compress the day into a single line. Israel claims 4 Egyptian jets shot down in Suez Canal battle. In Moscow, the names of the Soviet pilots will not be printed. In Israel, the pilots' families will eat dinner as usual. In the middle, above the canal, 12 men will trade seconds of eye contact for years of silence. The operation will work. The cost will take longer to surface. By early 1970, the Canal Zone had developed its own grammar of survival. Egyptian anti-aircraft crews stationed in bunkers along the western bank had learned to distinguish Israeli aircraft by sound alone. The high whine of Skyhawks, different from the deeper rumble of phantoms approaching from the east. But in February, a new silence arrived. Soviet air defense units began deploying under Operation Kavkaz, following President Gamal Abdel Nasser's winter visit to Moscow, where he had reportedly wept while describing the destruction of Egyptian infrastructure. The 135th Fighter Aviation Regiment brought MiG-21 MF interceptors and pilots whose call signs appeared on Israeli intercept logs without explanation. Intelligence summaries delivered to Prime Minister Golda Meir's office noted radar signatures, serial blocks, and formation patterns, but avoided the word Soviet in headings. Analysts preferred clinical phrases: improved discipline, shortened reaction time, higher intercept probability. One Air Force assessment reduced the change to a single observation. Increased reaction time meant Israeli pilots now had fewer seconds between radar warning and missile impact. In the operations room at Tel Nof, the wall map accumulated new red circles labeled simply SAM, Surface-to-Air Missile. Squadron Commander Avihu Ben Nun checked his watch during briefings, a habit that had begun as punctuality and become something closer to measurement. The shrinking corridor of safe flight calculated in seconds rather than kilometers. The sound of Soviet-operated radars sweeping Israeli aircraft had a different texture than Egyptian systems, steadier, more patient, the electronic equivalent of someone who knew they had time. A maintenance sergeant at Hatzor Air Base later recalled that the mood in those months felt like waiting for weather that had already been forecast. "We knew they were there," he told an interviewer decades later. "We just didn't say it out loud." The official position remained that Egypt operated its own air defenses. The unofficial reality was that every mission over the canal had become a calculation against an adversary whose government denied it existed. In April of 1970, after several near contacts between Israeli jets and Soviet-flown MiGs, the Israeli cabinet issued instructions to the Air Force through classified channels. The phrase preserved in one summary was carefully chosen: risk of superpower escalation. The practical effect was an invisible boundary drawn across Egyptian airspace. Areas where Soviet units were known to operate became zones of avoidance. Air Force Commander Mordecai Moti Hod signed orders limiting deep penetration raids into the Nile Delta. The war of attrition continued. Artillery duels, commando raids, airstrikes against military targets near the canal. But pilots received quiet guidance to disengage if Soviet-marked aircraft appeared. The reasoning was strategic. A direct clash with Moscow's pilots could escalate beyond anyone's control. Returning pilots described encounters that felt like shadowboxing. MiGs would follow Israeli formations, but not fire. Soviet radar would illuminate aircraft, hold the lock for seconds, then release. On 69 Squadron's briefing boards at Tel Nof, someone pinned a newspaper clipping about Soviet volunteers in Egypt next to a hand-drawn cartoon of a MiG with a hammer and sickle on its tail. The humor was thin. Ben Nun stirred sugar into a glass of coffee one morning, while younger pilots complained that they were flying around ghosts. He tapped the face of his watch, a steel Omega with a scratched crystal, and said nothing. The same hand that measured briefing times now measured something else. How long Soviet radar held lock before releasing. How quickly MiGs reached intercept altitude. The rhythm of an enemy learning Israeli patterns. A classified assessment from that period noted that restraint looked different depending on where you stood. From cabinet offices, it was prudent caution. From 30,000 feet, it felt like permission for someone else to choose when the fight would start. One pilot wrote in his personal log, "We're not avoiding combat. We're postponing it." By late June of 1970, the combined Egyptian-Soviet air defense network had pushed within kilometers of the canal. SA-3 missile batteries, more mobile and harder to detect than the older SA-2 systems, appeared in positions that Israeli intelligence had not predicted. FA-4 phantom losses mounted. One after-action report recorded the facts without emotion. 1 FA-4 downed, crew recovered. 1 FA-4 severely damaged, returned to base. The chalk marks on hangar floors at Hatzor told a more visceral story. Shrapnel patterns photographed, impact angles measured, maintenance crews taping small paper tags to each fragment of twisted metal. In planning meetings at Air Force headquarters, Hod and his senior officers reviewed maps showing Soviet radar coverage advancing west to east. Each line on the chart represented pilots who would have less warning, fewer seconds to decide whether to turn toward or away from a missile launch. The tension was both tactical and psychological. A superpower's forces now engaged Israeli aircraft routinely, while official communiques from Moscow and Jerusalem maintained the fiction that this was an Egyptian war. Ben Nun's watch became a recurring image in those sessions. He noted the interval between SAM radar activation and missile launch, the closing speed of MiGs scrambled from bases deeper in Egypt, the fuel margins that determined how long Israeli aircraft could loiter. An aide recalled that he rarely spoke during these meetings, preferring to listen and calculate. When he did speak, it was usually a question about timing. The strategic calculus was becoming clear. Every week of restraint allowed the Soviet network to strengthen. Every Israeli pullback invited another advance. The cabinet's caution had bought time, but time was now working against them. In one assessment, an analyst wrote, "The current posture is unsustainable. Either we accept permanent limitation of air operations over the canal zone, or we demonstrate that Soviet participation carries unacceptable cost. The decision to demonstrate cost would require political approval. It would also require a plan." Between January and July of 1970, the war of attrition transformed from an Egyptian-Israeli conflict into something more dangerous. Soviet pilots defended Egyptian airspace, while American diplomats warned both Moscow and Jerusalem about escalation. The public posture remained denial. Soviet forces were advisors, Israeli operations were defensive. But in classified channels, both sides acknowledged what was happening. The question was, who would blink first? In this space of managed ambiguity, Operation Rimon 20 was conceived, not as a stunt or a symbolic gesture, but as a message written in aircraft destroyed and pilots killed. The target was not Egyptian. It was Soviet confidence. By late July of 1970, the Soviet 135th Fighter Aviation Regiment operated from bases near Cairo and in the Nile Delta. Their mission was straightforward: intercept Israeli incursions and defend Egyptian infrastructure. Internal rosters listed pilots whose names would later appear in medal citations and memorial notices. Yevgeny Yakovlev, Nikolai Yurchenko, Georgy Sirkin, Vladimir Kamenev. These were experienced aviators, some with thousands of flight hours, trained in Soviet doctrine and confident in their MiG-21 MF interceptors. From the Israeli side, they appeared first as abstractions: call signs on intercept plots, formation patterns on radar screens, improved interception capability in intelligence summaries. One analyst noted that Soviet pilots favored high-speed climbs and tight formations, maintaining discipline even under pressure. They rarely broke formation unnecessarily, a contrast to Egyptian pilots, whose reactions were often more improvised. In personnel files at Soviet air bases, these men had families, training records, previous assignments. Yakovlev had flown in the Far East before his Egypt posting. Yurchenko was known for precise instrument flying. Sirkin had instructed younger pilots. Their photographs showed men in flight suits, some smiling, others serious, standing beside aircraft with Egyptian markings that concealed their origin. The abstraction worked both ways. Israeli pilots appeared in Soviet reports as aggressive, unpredictable, willing to take risks that Soviet doctrine considered unnecessary. Neither side knew the other as individuals. The engagement to come would change that, briefly, violently, and without names exchanged. On the 25th of July, 1970, Soviet-flown MiG-21s intercepted Israeli A-4 Skyhawks returning from a raid near the canal. The engagement was brief. Missiles fired, evasive maneuvers executed, no aircraft lost on either side. But its significance was immediate. For the first time, Soviet pilots had actively fired at Israeli aircraft, not merely tracked them. Debriefing forms from Israeli squadrons captured fragments of the experience. One pilot noted that the radar warning receiver sounded colder than usual, a steadier tone, less erratic than Egyptian systems. Another described watching a MiG hold formation with textbook precision before breaking away. The professionalism was unmistakable and, in its way, more unsettling than aggression. At Tel Nof, Ben Noon conducted his own analysis. During debriefs, he tapped his watch at specific moments, noting how long it took Soviet MiGs to reach intercept altitude after Israeli aircraft crossed certain distance markers. The same gesture that measured briefing punctuality now measured something operational. Soviet reaction time was faster than anticipated, their coordination with ground control tighter. If they could find Israeli jets so quickly, the inverse was also true. Their patterns could be predicted. In the ready room, someone updated the hand-drawn cartoon of the Soviet MiG. The hammer and sickle now had a small flame drawn beneath it. The humor had an edge. A signals intelligence summary from those days noted that Soviet radio discipline was excellent. Brief transmissions, standardized phraseology, minimal chatter. Listening to their communications was like hearing a machine operate. But machines could be baited. The question was whether Israeli planners could design a trap that Soviet professionalism would not detect until too late. In the final days of July, Mossad and his senior officers finalized the operational concept that would become Rimon 20. The plan, reconstructed from Air Force records and participant interviews, read like a mathematical problem with human variables. Phase 1. F-4E Phantoms from 69 Squadron would attack an Egyptian radar station near Sakna, southeast of Suez. The flight profile would mimic earlier Skyhawk raids, altitudes, speeds, and ingress routes chosen to match patterns Soviet observers had logged for months. The attack would appear routine, unremarkable. Phase 2. 4 Mirage 3CJ fighters from 119 Squadron would enter Egyptian airspace near Hurghada, climbing to 35,000 feet and flying in tight formation to appear as a single radar blip. They would be the bait. Visible, apparently vulnerable, irresistible to Soviet interceptors scrambling to protect Egyptian skies. Phase 3. 4 additional Mirages from 117 Squadron and more Phantoms would wait at low altitude over Sinai, masked by terrain and electronic countermeasures. When Soviet MiGs committed to intercept the bait formation, these aircraft would climb from below and behind, closing a trap the MiGs would not see until they were inside it. The written orders specified aircraft types, weapons loads, and timing down to minutes. Mirage pilots would carry AIM-9D Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles and extra fuel. Phantoms would carry Sparrow radar-guided missiles for longer-range shots. Ground controllers in the Negev would coordinate the engagement, calling aircraft into position as the geometry developed. In the margin of one briefing copy, an anonymous hand had sketched a simple diagram, a small dot leading a line of triangles into a semicircle. Ben Nun, reviewing fuel calculations, tapped his watch again. The bait could hold for approximately 11 minutes before fuel state forced a decision. Everything would depend on whether the Soviets took that bait within the window. Before Rimon 20 could launch, the political level had to approve what would be, in effect, a deliberate ambush of Soviet military pilots. The decision rested with Golda Meir and a small circle of cabinet members who understood what was being proposed. Accounts of those discussions, partially reconstructed from participant memoirs and declassified summaries, describe a weighing of risks. The Soviet advance toward the canal threatened Israel's strategic depth more immediately than the possibility of escalation. Moscow had pushed forward without apparent limit. Perhaps a sharp blow would establish new limits. The alternative, continued restraint, meant accepting permanent restriction of Israeli air operations and the gradual erosion of deterrence. Meir reportedly asked 2 questions. Could the operation succeed militarily? Could it be contained politically? The answers were conditional. Success depended on Soviet pilots responding as they had before. Aggressively, predictably, within the window Israeli planners had calculated. Containment depended on both sides, having reasons to avoid wider escalation. American channels were informed enough to prevent misinterpretation, but not enough to invite interference. Cabinet minutes from the final approval remain classified. What is known is that the operation received authorization in late July, with the understanding that it would be executed at the first favorable opportunity. The burden of decision passed from politicians to pilots. At Tel Nof, the final briefing sheet was initialed. Ben Nun's watch marked the moment the operation moved from concept to order. Outside, ground crews moved spare tires across the tarmac. Trucks followed their usual routes. The afternoon light looked like any other day of the war. In the ready room, pilots reviewed their assignments without knowing that the target this time was not Egyptian infrastructure, but Soviet confidence itself. On the 30th of July, 1970, at 1400 hours Israel time, Phantom crews began the first phase. Ben Nun, with navigator Zvi Kessler, led the strike against the Egyptian radar installation at Sakna. The flight profile was deliberately familiar. Altitude, approach angle, and timing chosen to match dozens of previous raids that Soviet observers had catalogued. Mission logs recorded ordnance and fuel states. Maintenance forms listed Sparrow missiles loaded, sidewinders mounted, external tanks attached for the long flight. The mechanics of preparation were identical to any other strike mission. Only the operation order distinguished this day from the ones before. In the Phantom cockpit, the temperature gauge climbed as the sealed canopy trapped the desert heat. Checklists replaced conversation. The gloved hand that had pointed to maps in briefing rooms now moved across switches. Master arm, weapons select, radar mode. The strike itself was secondary, a means to an end. The real target was the Soviet response it would provoke. Below, the radar installation at Sokhna received the attack without knowing its purpose. Anti-aircraft fire rose, tracking systems attempted lock. The familiar choreography of air defense played out. What the defenders did not know was that the raid was designed to fail. Not fail catastrophically, but fail to achieve anything permanent. Its function was to appear normal, to fit the pattern, to give Soviet controllers no reason to suspect that anything unusual was developing. As Ben Nunn's Phantom completed its pass and turned east toward home, the radar returns showed nothing out of the ordinary. Somewhere in a control room, a Soviet duty officer would be logging another Israeli nuisance raid. Somewhere else, MiG pilots were already receiving orders to intercept a different target. 4 aircraft climbing high over Hurghada, moving slowly, apparently unaware they were being watched. At roughly the same time, 4 119 Squadron Mirages under Amos Amir lifted off and skimmed the Gulf of Suez at low altitude before climbing sharply to 35,000 feet. Flying in tight formation, they compressed their radar signature into what appeared to be 1 or 2 aircraft. A small reconnaissance flight. The kind Soviet controllers had seen dozens of times. Each Mirage 3CJ carried a pair of AIM-9D Sidewinder heat-seeking missiles and enough fuel for approximately 11 minutes of combat operations. Among the pilots were Asher Sneer, Avraham Salman, and Avi Gilad, names that would later appear in Air Force citations. Their job description was simple and terrifying. Attract Soviet interceptors and survive long enough for the trap to close. Air Force accounts note that Soviet response took longer than expected, approximately 11 minutes from initial detection to MiG scramble, stretching tension to its limit. In Israeli cockpits, fuel gauges became the primary instrument. Every second of delay was altitude traded against endurance, survival margins narrowing. On Soviet radar screens, the 4 Mirages looked like routine intruders following a familiar pattern. Radio traffic remained clipped. Maintain altitude. Hold formation. Negative contact. No one said they've taken the bait, but every pilot understood that they had passed the point where turning back was possible without losing the operation's purpose. In a Soviet control room somewhere in Egypt, the duty officer evaluated the radar picture and decided it matched previous reconnaissance patterns. MiGs were ordered into the air. The intercept vector was calculated. 4 Soviet pilots began their climb, unaware that below the radar horizon, Phantoms and additional Mirages were waiting for exactly this moment. The watch on Ben Nunn's wrist, now in a Phantom returning from Sokhna, showed seconds passing. Somewhere over Sinai, his wingmen began their own climb. Soviet records and Israeli reconstructions indicate that an initial 4 MiG-21s scrambled from Egyptian bases, soon joined by additional pairs until the Soviet force in the area may have numbered 12 aircraft or more. Ground controllers vectored them toward what appeared to be a small, slow-moving group of intruders, Easy prey, a routine intercept. When the distance closed to engagement range, the second phase began. The mirages turned west, drawing the MiGs further from their bases and deeper into the ambush. Below and behind, phantoms and additional mirages climbed from low altitude, invisible until they reached the engagement altitude with the Soviet formation between them and the bait. The sky became a vertical arena. Mirages ahead, MiGs behind them, phantoms rising unseen from below. The geometry that Israeli planners had drawn on briefing room maps was now real, measured in closing speeds and missile ranges. Radio transcripts preserved in Air Force archives capture fragments of the moment. Turn left, engaging. Fox 2. Break right. Missile away. The language of combat was functional, stripped of everything except information. Beneath the headsets, pilots experienced what transcripts could not record. The physical force of high G turns, the tunnel vision of target fixation, the sound of their own breathing amplified in the mask. Ben Nunn, now in position with the Phantom element, used the same watch that had measured planning sessions to calculate closing distance and missile parameters. The abstraction of briefing room diagrams collapsed into 3 dimensions of aircraft, missiles, and men making decisions in fractions of seconds. Somewhere in the swirling formation, a Soviet pilot realized the intercept had become an ambush. By then, the first Sidewinder had already left its rail. The engagement lasted minutes. Israeli sources credit kills to Avraham Salmon, Asher Sneer, Avihu Ben Nun, Aviam Sela, and at least one additional pilot. The sequence, reconstructed from debriefs and recorded communications, was rapid and violent. Salmon saw MiGs closing on a Phantom's tail and called the warning. He rolled in behind Nikolai Yurchenko's aircraft and fired an AIM-9D Sidewinder. The missile tracked true. Yurchenko's MiG disintegrated. There was no ejection. Sneer engaged Yevgeny Yakovlev in a turning fight that ended with a Sidewinder striking the MiG's belly. Yakovlev ejected but was seen to die during his descent. Chute malfunction, injuries, or both. The cause was never officially determined. A Phantom crew fired a Sparrow radar-guided missile that destroyed another MiG, killing Kamenev. The radar-guided missile had performed exactly as designed, finding its target at a range where visual identification was impossible. The pilot who fired it would not know for days whose aircraft he had destroyed. Gorgy Sirkin died in a separate engagement. His MiG struck by weapons whose source was disputed. Sidewinder or Sparrow, Mirage or Phantom. In the chaos of converging aircraft, precise attribution was secondary to survival. In total, 5 Soviet-piloted MiG-21s were destroyed. Israeli losses amounted to 1 Mirage damaged by cannon fire, which managed to return to base with its pilot uninjured. On the Soviet side, surviving pilots later described the engagement as a sudden reversal. The clean geometry of the intercept shattered. Ground control unable to provide coherent guidance. Wingmen disappearing from formation without warning. What was meant to be a routine bounce had become something else entirely. When the last missile burned out and fuel states forced disengagement, the sky over the Gulf of Suez was empty except for contrails already dispersing in the wind. Within hours, international wire services reported that Israel had shot down 4 Egyptian jets over the Canal Zone. Neither government acknowledged Soviet involvement. In the first communiques, the pilots were anonymous, nationality unspecified. Egyptian statements denied any losses. The diplomatic fiction held barely. But correspondents in Cairo and Moscow began collecting fragments that did not fit the official story. Unusual funerals. Soviet transport aircraft landing at Egyptian bases. quiet medal ceremonies. Within days, some press reports openly described the downed pilots as Russian. By autumn, Golda Meir would publicly acknowledge that Israeli aircraft had clashed with Soviet pilots over the canal. In Soviet records, the dead received posthumous decorations and entries in unit histories that acknowledged combat losses without detailing circumstances. Lessons were drawn about doctrine, formation discipline, the danger of pursuing targets into unfamiliar airspace. The pilots' families received notification through military channels. Their sons and husbands had died in Egypt, defending an ally. That was what the official version said. In Israeli squadron rooms, the debriefs were more visceral. Pilots drew diagrams on chalkboards with grease pencils, reconstructing split-second decisions, debating missile performance and closure rates. The mood was professional satisfaction, tempered by awareness of how narrow the margins had been. A different wind direction, a slower Soviet response, a jammed missile rail. Any of these could have changed the outcome. Ben Noon's watch appeared in photographs from the award ceremonies that followed. The same steel omega with the scratched crystal, catching fluorescent light as he accepted congratulations. The watch had measured planning sessions, Soviet reaction times, and missile flight paths. Now it measured something else. The distance between an operation remembered as a triumph and one that might have become a disaster. The files began to close on Rimon 20. The questions they raised would take longer to answer. Later assessments described Rimon 20 as a morale-boosting achievement, a crown jewel of Israeli Air Force combat heritage. 5 Soviet pilots dead, no Israeli losses, by any tactical measure, a success. But the operation did not end the war of attrition. It did not push Soviet forces out of Egypt. It did not resolve the fundamental conflict over the canal zone. Within days, Soviet and Egyptian forces responded with their own trap, dummy missile batteries designed to lure Israeli jets into kill zones. On the 3rd of August, 1970, an Israeli F-4 Phantom was shot down and another badly damaged. The cost of demonstrating Soviet vulnerability was a reminder that vulnerability worked both ways. Yet, something did change. American policymakers, watching direct combat between Israeli and Soviet aircraft, accelerated diplomatic pressure for a ceasefire. The fear of escalation that had restrained Israeli operations now worked on Washington. By the 7th of August, a ceasefire agreement ended the war of attrition. Without resolving any underlying disputes, without withdrawing Soviet forces, without guaranteeing the peace that both sides claimed to want. For the pilots who flew Rimon 20, later careers and interviews showed a mix of professional pride and awareness of contingency. Ben Noon eventually commanded the Israeli Air Force. Others continued flying or moved into civilian roles. They had done what they were ordered to do, done it well, and survived. That was what military success looked like. The larger questions, whether the operation prevented escalation or merely delayed it, whether killing Soviet pilots made Israel safer or simply more isolated, remained unanswered. The watch on Ben Noon's wrist had measured many things in those months. Briefing times, reaction intervals, missile flight paths, fuel margins. After the 30th of July, it measured something harder to calculate. The distance between an afternoon when everything worked and the knowledge that another afternoon might not end the same way. The hands kept moving. The measurement never stopped. Years later, in an Air Force Museum display, a faded operations map from the 30th of July, 1970, hangs behind glass. Red grease pencil arrows mark the Mirage's climb. Blue lines trace the MiG-21 intercepts. Green circles show the Phantom's holding pattern over Sinai. The geometry is clean, almost elegant. A diagram of intention that became, for a few minutes, reality. In the corner of the frame, almost cropped out, is a black and white photograph. A pilot sits on a folding chair beside a Mirage, head lowered, fingers resting on the face of a simple wristwatch. The caption mentions neither the Soviet Union nor the pilots who died. It lists only the date and the code name, Operation Rimon 20. The engines in the photograph are silent. The sky behind the pilot is clear, bleached by afternoon light that reveals nothing about what happened above it. The sound that remains is imagined. The soft tick of a watch that once measured the distance between deterrence and catastrophe. Between a message successfully delivered and a war that might have spiraled beyond anyone's control. The museum display does not explain what the operation meant. It does not say whether the dead Soviet pilots were brave or foolish, whether the Israeli pilots were heroes or instruments of policy, whether the engagement prevented a larger war or simply became another chapter in an endless one. It presents objects and lets visitors draw their own conclusions. Outside the museum, the sky over Tel Nof remains the same sky. Indifferent, unchanging, marking time in ways that watches cannot measure. The pilots who flew that day are older now or gone. The aircraft they flew are museum pieces or scrap metal. Only the questions remain, quiet as a watch face, waiting for someone to look closely enough to read them.